Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks so much for being here for our special celebrating America's founders. Always worth the time to celebrate this country. Just something you're not supposed to do anymore. We are swimming right now in a cultural soup that is telling us to hate this country. And that can have a very dramatic influence on people, even the best of us. You've heard, of course, by now that hammer thrower woman who turned her back on the podium with her flag and the whole of the right. She wouldn't look at the flag. This was her 4 years ago when she made the Olympic team. And that's her today. Critical race theory is a drug. It can destroy you. Same thing with all these Black Lives Matter athletes, LeBron, Kaepernick. They used to love America. Now they hate it. Or at least that's what they say to get attention and make their money. But their lack of patriotism, it's killing us from within. So in today's special, we're going to reinvigorate that in all of us. We're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson, who of course wrote the Declaration of Indepence that we celebrated on the 4th of July. We're going to talk about Frederick Douglass, who wasn't a founder, he's a former slave. But he was so instrumental in making sure that we live up to the ideals of the Declaration. And then we're going to learn about an incredibly pivotal moment in our history, Washington crossing the Delaware. We need to know these stories. We need to know how impossible it was for this country to even have been formed in the first place. We need to understand how revolutionary it is that we exist. We are living in the revolution. Because only once we appreciate it can we truly fight against the people who want to erase all of it. Can I share one of my favorite founding stories? So here's the deal. Voting on independence. Right? Every colony had a certain number of delegates, and a majority of those delegates had to vote for independence in order for that state to vote for independence, right? So Delaware had 3 delegates. Thomas McKean, George Reed, they were in Philadelphia, they were debating. Cesar Rodney, the 3rd delegate, was back in Dover, right? So he's back in Dover doing his thing, and he gets a letter. And it was a letter from McKean. And it was telling Rodney, man, I'm voting for independence. George Reed is not. We're 1-1. We need you here to vote yes on independence. If you don't vote yes, Delaware's a no, and this whole thing's going to break down. I need you, bud. I need you, Caesar. You need to be the tie-breaking vote for this country. And we're going to vote tomorrow. They actually voted on July 2nd. He got this letter on July 1st. He got it the night before. He immediately climbed on his horse, rode 80 miles. It took him 14 hours through a thunderstorm. And he arrived at the hall covered in mud, sick and exhausted. He was wearing his boots and his spurs, and he got there just as the voting was starting. And he cast the tie-breaking vote for Delaware. Here's, just as you can visualize this is John Adams writing about Cesar Rodney. John Adams, who was a funny-looking guy himself, said he is the oddest-looking man in the world. He's tall, thin, and slender as a reed, pale. His face is not bigger than a large apple. Yet there is sense and fire, spirit, wit, and humor in his countenance. 1 Samuel 16:7, God says to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And Rodney had a heart for independence. He rode 80 miles in a thunderstorm to be that deciding vote. Independence relied on him. Delaware voting yes convinced South Carolina and Pennsylvania to change their votes for independence. New York remained the only state that held out for like another week before they finally ultimately joined in. If you've ever seen the HBO miniseries John Adams, you need to watch it. And if you haven't seen it in a long time, you need to watch it again. And I just want to play a minute of this scene where they're taking the votes, right? They're going around and asking every state how they vote. And you can see the subtle nod that they give to Cesar Rodney. If you don't know what you're looking for, you would never notice this even. But if you look carefully, now you know the story of Cesar Rodney. You can see him enter at just the nick of time.
New York. New York has yet to receive new instructions from its constituent assembly. We therefore respectfully abstain.
Connecticut.
Connecticut votes yes.
New Jersey.
That was him. Did you see him walk in? That was him in the middle of the voting. They voted right after that, and he got up and he said this. He said, "As I believe the voice of my constituents and all sensible and honest men is in favor of independence, and my own judgment concurs with them, Delaware votes for independence." What if Cesar Rodney didn't bother? What if he was like, I don't know if I can make it by tomorrow. I'll just stay here. Or what if he was halfway there and he's like, man, I'm real tired. I'm just gonna take a quick nap. I'll come, later that night. I'm sure it'll be fine. What if he decided to stay home? What if for him it wasn't worth it? Cesar Rodney had asthma. He had gout. He had a terrible cancer on his face. He would wear these coverings and these bandages all over his face because he was so deformed. It was believed that the only doctors who could treat him were in England. But by signing this declaration, he was now a traitor. So he would never get the medical treatment that he needed. And he did it anyway. The last line of the Declaration of Independence, it's one of the greatest lines ever. It says, "For the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." How good is that? We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The state quarter, every state has their quarter thing. I don't know if, I'm sure they've gone through all 50 by now, right? But the state quarter of Delaware is this right here. Most people look at that and they assume it's Paul Revere. But that doesn't make any sense. That was in Boston. That's Cesar Rodney. That's his midnight ride to vote for independence. Truly, and you could say this about many people, about many moments. That's why the whole thing, any one of these pivotal moments, like we'll talk about George Washington crossing the Delaware in a little bit, any one of these pivotal moments, if it didn't work, the whole thing wouldn't have worked. Fighting against the greatest military that the world's ever known, right? A bunch of ragtag colonists here. Like there's so many different pivotal moments. We'll talk about one of them later. But one of them is this. If Cesar Rodney did not make it there in time, the vote would have failed. Can you imagine that? Like, we know the history. We know what happened. We know the end of the story. But if Cesar Rodney did not show up in time, the vote would have failed. Thomas Jefferson, he later wrote to Caesar, decades later. He said, "Continue to go straight forward, pursuing always that which is right." I want to end with this. John Locke, we'll talk a bit about him coming up later too. He said, this is the inspiration for this segment. The improvement of our understanding, this special I should say, the improvement of our understanding of our history is for two ends. First, for our own increase of knowledge. Secondly, to enable us to deliver and make out that knowledge to others. The greatest part of your business and usefulness in the world is by the influence of what you say or write to others. In other words, spread the word. That's how we end every segment. Spread the word. Now you know the story of Cesar Rodney. Tell your kids. Tell your grandkids. Spread the word. We are all standing on the shoulders of the great thinkers who came before us. And we all must continue to understand America at an even deeper level than we do now. Now more than ever, we have to spread the word. Because there are people out there who are very good at spreading their word. That America's a terrible, racist, evil, horrible country that was founded on slavery and is embedded with slavery in every aspect, every institution. Those people are good. They're liars. They're good. We need to know the truth. So for the next 45 minutes, let's learn about Washington crossing the Delaware. Let's analyze Frederick Douglass, his great speech in 1852, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And coming up next with Congressman Tom McClintock, a history buff, we'll talk about Thomas Jefferson himself. Coming up next, true story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Celebrating America's Founders. I want to go to one of the best congressmen in D.C., Congressman Tom McClintock, representing this crazy state of California. Congressman, how are you, sir?
I'm fine, Mike. Thank you.
I'm grateful you're here, and I'm happy to talk about something other than politics for a couple minutes with you. Let's celebrate Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote this Declaration of Independence. Why is Thomas Jefferson a man worth celebrating? As statues are being torn down across the country, why should we celebrate Thomas Jefferson?
Well, in many ways, as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, he was the voice of the American Revolution. And it was his work that put into that Declaration of Independence, that birth certificate of America, principles that, as Abraham Lincoln later said, he was convinced would place slavery upon the course of ultimate extinction, and it did. So to see his statue torn down by those who say they are upset over slavery, this was the man who set in motion the principles that destroyed slavery, not only here, but throughout the world.
Where did Thomas Jefferson get his philosophy / genius and brilliance to write such a document?
Well, there was actually a committee of 5, and a year before his death, he said that, recalling what had unfolded, they'd gotten together and they decided they weren't going to plow any new ground. They were going to draw from the American experience under British rule. They wanted the Declaration to be an expression of the American mind. Obviously, John Locke had a major influence on the political thinking, not only of the founders, but of the entire population. And certainly the founders, and especially his second treatise, Locke's second treatise, that argued that there are rights that exist in nature, that governments are created by men and women to protect those rights. Those rights cannot be legitimately denied them. That's the whole essence of the second paragraph of the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed not by government, but by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable meaning they cannot be taken away, they cannot be given away. You are born with those rights. Then we create governments to protect those rights. And what are they? Well, we all know what they are. They call them self-evident because you can deduce them simply from the natural order of things. The right to your own opinions and to express them freely, the right to the fruit of your own labor, the right to raise your family according to your own values, the right to defend yourself from predators. These are all natural rights that obviously exist in nature. Therefore, they can't come from government. And if they don't come from government, they come from God. And that was the foundation of American liberty. There are many republics and many democracies across the world today. But to my knowledge, only one is founded on that fundamental principle that our rights do not come from the government, they come from God. We create the government to protect them, and anytime the government becomes hostile to them, that government renounces its legitimacy, and it becomes our right and duty to alter or abolish it.
We have people in America today who are pushing for a revolution, and what they don't understand is we are living the revolution. This is the revolutionary idea. Out of all those you listed, what do you think is the most revolutionary in history?
Well, again, I think it comes down to that foundational assumption that if we repealed the Bill of Rights in our Constitution tomorrow, what would happen to our freedom of speech or our freedom to defend ourselves enshrined in the Second Amendment? Nothing would happen to them because we don't get them from the government. The Bill of Rights simply pledges our government to protect them. And that was truly revolutionary in an age when all of the legitimacy of government was placed in the government, not in the people. Again, many democracies, many republics This is the one where the sovereign is not the king or the government. The sovereign is the people. The government works for that sovereign.
What do you think human nature prefers? and I say that because you talked earlier about the expression of the American mind, which is such an amazing thing, because in 1776, America was only around for what was the American mind that they were expressing with such a young country? But then the question is, well, what's the American mind today? And then what is human nature's impulse when it comes to our rights and dictators?
These principles don't change because these principles are rooted in human nature, and human nature doesn't change. I think in every controversy, in every country, in every period of history, there are basically two parties. There's a party of freedom and there's a party of authoritarianism. They'll go by different names in different periods and different places, but they're the same two parties because they are rooted in our own human nature. On the one hand, we're hierarchical creatures. We really like it when people do what we tell them to do. On the other hand, we are always happier and more prosperous when we are left alone to lead our own lives. It's those two different drives set in motion against each other that are in our own human nature and therefore are reflected in every political controversy that's ever come down the pike. The American founders believed in freedom, and they set up a government answerable to the people with the express purpose of protecting our freedom.
I don't want to get too temporary or contemporary, and I'm not asking you to name names, but do you think a lot of our leaders today don't get it? They don't get the things you said, or they disagree with what you said? Like, do they think they're the party of freedom, but they're actually the party or people of authoritarian control? Or what do you think the...
Oh, no, I think those two parties exist today, very clear, and have always existed. Remember, Abraham Lincoln's famous warning that the house divided against itself cannot stand. If you remember, he went on to say, I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It must become all one thing or all the other. He understood that there are times when antithetical principles are vying for the future. Principles that simply cannot logically coexist, matter and antimatter. And Lincoln understood slavery and freedom were such principles. The two, you could try to hold them together in an uneasy coalition as the founders did, but ultimately he understood that one had to devour the other because they were simply opposites. They couldn't exist together. I think that wheel's come full circle. And today, those two antithetical principles are freedom and socialism. If you think about it, slavery and socialism spring from exactly the same poisonous principle. As Lincoln put it, you work and toil and make bread, and I will eat it. Socialism is just as incompatible with freedom as slavery was, and I think that that's why you're seeing the controversies now escalate, because ultimately those two principles cannot be compromised. One must triumph. And the other must be vanquished. And God help us turn to socialism.
My last question for you, Congressman. I'm sure you heard about the National Archives and their memo about structural racism of rich white guys in the rotunda where our Declaration is physically held and all the rest. And we know, we've seen many, many examples of this. But when you walk through the Congress and the rotunda and all these beautiful statues and paintings, and say, what stands out to you the most? Which one of these paintings or stories do you see that inspires you as you go to work every day?
Well, the story of liberty, half of the Capitol Rotunda is the famous John Trumbull paintings of the story of the American Revolution. And they start with the American founders setting forth those bold revolutionary principles that we've discussed. And they go through the travails, ultimately the victory at Saratoga, the victory at Yorktown when George Washington was an American Caesar. He had an army behind him with the adulation of the people. He could easily have claimed a position of Caesar, and yet in the final portrait, he becomes an American Cincinnatus, surrendering his army, not to the forces of tyranny, but to the American Congress then in Baltimore. That's the story of freedom. And to those who say that, oh, well, that was racist, Abraham Lincoln confronted that question very clearly in his last debate with Stephen Douglas at Alton. And he said, this is what Stephen Douglas says, that the principles of the American Declaration were not meant for everybody. He said, I have gone through all of the writings of the founders. I defy him to find one person who said or thought that. One. He said, the first time I heard that was Justice Taney in the Dred Scott decision, and the second time I heard that was Stephen Douglas. And he said that sentiment is evil in its tendency, if not in its design. And yet we see that same canard being brought back again by the American left for the same purpose that Stephen Douglas raised it, and that was divide our country.
Are those statues and paintings going to remain long in the Capitol Rotunda?
That depends upon the American people. It's the American people through their sacrifices that wrote that history that's depicted in that rotunda. It's now up to the American people to defend that history, or they will lose it for all time.
Congressman McClintock in California. Sir, I'd rather talk this than politics, but let's do both again another day.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate you. Coming up next, we'll talk about the great Frederick Douglass, followed by George Washington crossing the Delaware. All coming up. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Celebrating America's Founders. Now, the man we're going to talk about next, not technically one of our founders of 1776, but certainly in many, many ways a founder in the helping to fulfill, I don't want to say redefine, but fulfill our nation's founding promises. He's one of the greatest Americans who ever lived, there's no doubt about it. Frederick Douglass. Every American needs to know him and know his story. To help us understand this man, and one speech in particular that's often quoted, and I should say misquoted, around the 4th of July. We're going to get the greater detail from one of the co-authors of Black History 365, an inclusive account of American history, and that's Dr. Walter Milton. Dr. Milton, how are you, sir?
I am truly honored. I'm doing really well today, Mike. Thanks for having me on your show.
Great to talk to you. So I want to talk specifically about his speech, The Meaning of July 4th for the Negro in 1852. But help us set the stage. Who was Frederick Douglass?
Well, Frederick Douglass was an advocate for justice. He truly was. He was really dedicated to the whole spirit of liberation and bringing about a strong sense of equality for all American citizens, particularly Black citizens who were in the antebellum South, experiencing slavery and the magnitude of some of the challenge that had taken place in the lives of so many Blacks at that time.
And he was a slave himself. Who became a free man, right?
Absolutely. And he was very creative in terms of freeing himself, in terms of escaping. But he is known throughout history as one of the staunch advocates to bring about liberation and really leading the whole charge of abolitionism.
How was he so brilliant? I mean, we read this speech here, and I encourage everyone to. It's like no one even writes like this today, let alone in 1852, let alone a former slave. How was he so genius?
Well, he learned to read early by others. And one thing that's really remarkable about Frederick Douglass is that when he was really embracing himself in terms of reading and mastering literacy and understanding the magnitude of that, his slave master at that time was beating him. And he said, if anything, if the way that they're beating me, this must be worth having the ability to be competent literally, having the ability to read, and having the ability to really speak the language and to own the language. And so he was masterful at really providing that. And from this speech and other orations that he had really indicated this. He was a genius.
And I think of our literacy rates today and how poor they are, and it's free to everybody to learn to read, unlike what he had to go through. Okay, so take us to this moment. 1852, we're not at war yet. Obviously, slavery is at a peak. Where did he give this speech?
He gave this speech in my hometown, I'm proud to say, Rochester, New York. And the speech was provided by the Rochester ladies of anti-slavery society. And really, they wanted Frederick to really talk about some of the challenges and some of the things that really kept many blacks in an abyss at that moment. And so he gave the speech right before the known holiday called the 4th of July. And the title was, "What to the American Slave is Your 4th of July?" And it was a really remarkable question. And he talked about some of the challenges and vicissitudes that many blacks across this country were dealing with at that time, the onslaught of degradation and those things. And he said that, it's very difficult for me to really embrace this when myself and my people are experiencing a high magnitude of discrimination. But he was really proficient in terms of having a large base in terms of supporting him and understanding the importance of the speech. And I think that what happened here, it was a platform for him to really be very specific about some of the challenges and to really speak to the heart and soul of the listeners. And I think that the speech had softened a lot of people. It really did, because it brought about a strong sense of the reality that was impacting and vexing our country at that time.
I hear a lot of people bring up the speech and they talk about, they only quote the parts where he really badmouthed America. How would you characterize his criticisms?
Well, I think that he was speaking from a realistic standpoint. And we have to understand, if we paint the picture at that time, it was much different than it is right now, because we had a large degree of the black population who were not free. And they were in the thralls of degradation, and they were really feeling it. And there's an old quote that says, "He who knows it feels it, and he who feels it knows it." And so it's very different. But at the same time, he demonstrated his level of excellence. He demonstrated his voice and his strong sense of advocacy to bring about liberation for all Americans, particularly his people at that time.
Was there a turn in the speech? Did he ever turn into a positive about the future of former slaves in America?
He talked about hope. He really did. He talked about the vision that he would see one day. But he told the truth. And I think that the truth is something that we need. And it's not a truth to denounce one specific group to elevate another. The truth is a truth. And I think that all of us can really grow and benefit from that. And it could make our country even better than the greatness that we already possess.
How did Frederick Douglass ultimately feel about this country?
I think he felt a strong sense of adulation because of the accomplishments that have taken place, but he also felt deep pain. He felt the pains and scars of those people that were brought against their will to do the work, but he also knew that part of the contemporary time in which he lived, and as well as the future, and looking at it from a historical context, there were many contributions that many blacks have made to create where we are, and we have the right to be American, and with that comes a indelible responsibility to really live up to the creed and the origins of what's expected.
What's this song he ended his speech with?
I think the song. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry. So it's in the fervent aspirations of William Lloyd Garrison, I say, and let every heart join in saying, Godspeed the year of Jubilee, the wide world over. And he goes on for 3 stanzas. Why?
Well, he wanted to really have the voice of freedom. And he knew that it's going to take the human spirit to really bring about that level of freedom, not just blacks, but it's going to take whites and blacks and everyone coming together to bring about this sense of freedom. And he was an abolitionist. And if you look at the work that William Lloyd Garrison had done in terms of abolitionism during that period of time, it was incredibly important that he gets all Americans involved in this. And so that's what Frederick Douglass was about. He had a platform, and he took advantage of that platform to really expose the beauty, the ills, and the challenges that we were facing at that time.
How do you think the ladies in the audience took this speech?
Well, I think that he was a good-looking guy. I need to say that. So that's a whole ball game. But I think they took it because embedded in all of them is this whole notion, and I'm not talking from a literal construct, but that this whole notion of mothering. And through mothering, it's caring. It's wanting the best for all humans. And I really think that the group of women, the ladies of anti-slavery society, they were really about abolitionism at that time to really bring about a strong sense of freedom. And all throughout the city of Rochester, New York, you can see relics of that and people really adhering to those things. So I'm very proud to be from there, and I'm very proud to have this knowledge and experience this. I remember when I was a classroom teacher that my principal gave me the platform. I was in Brighton Central School District, a gentleman by the name of Roy Welkley. I just want to publicly give him a shout out. And he took me there to the district, and he took the textbook and he threw it out of the window. I'll never forget this. And he said, I don't want you to teach from this. I want you to teach the truth. And I want you to make it come alive, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to dispel stereotypes and bring about a strong sense of bringing clarity to the misconceptions that have vexed our country all these years.
Let me go back to your teaching days, because I feel like this speech is often brought up, misquoted, mischaracterized as a bludgeon against America. Like, see, even like Frederick Douglass, what is 4th of July to a slave, and still today, what is 4th of July to a black person in America? It's nothing worth celebrating, et cetera, et cetera. How do you feel about that, and how would you use this speech to teach kids today?
I think that if we keep it in the proper context, which is history, and I think that we have to be very truth-centric when it comes to history. So we have to really talk about what took place during that time period and prior to that. And that was pivotal because those are the things that has helped us to this day. You know, all of the challenges, all of the remarkable gains really came from that. And I think that we have to be celebratory because we are Americans and we have a right to really participate in the democratic process and the American values and American way of life. So I think that right was earned by all citizens. And I think that we have a indelible responsibility to teach history from the context of the truth.
Absolutely. Black History 365, an inclusive account of American history, Dr. Walter Milton. Sir, let's talk again, sir. I'm grateful for you.
I'm honored to be on your show. I wish you all the success in the world, and thank you. And you're almost a hometown guy like me. So
that's right. We got to stick together. Thank you, brother. And I hope that inspires you to go read The Meaning of July 4th for the Negro. Sit down and read it properly. I don't mean to be rude, but it's really good, and it's a tougher read. So if you sit down in a quiet place, sit down for an hour and just read through it and be amazed at what this man lived through and was able to overcome and fight for where we are today. It's a beautiful speech. Coming up next, we'll talk about another pivotal moment in our history. George Washington crossing the Delaware River. It shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have worked. We'll talk about it next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special Celebrating America's Founders. I love learning about these pivotal moments in our history and these moments where they seem so impossible. Like there's no way that it happened, there's no way it worked, and if it didn't work, then who knows where we'd be today. I love learning about these stories, and I don't know if there's one more pivotal than George Washington crossing the Delaware. So let's learn all about that with Matthew Spalding. He's the Vice President and Dean of the Hillsdale College Graduate School in D.C., former Executive Director of the 1776 Commission, and author of We Still Hold These Truths, Rediscovering Our Principles and Reclaiming Our Future. Mr. Spalding, how are you, sir?
I'm great. Great to be with you, and thanks for doing this
Good.
series.
Yeah, good to talk to you. So let's set the scene for us. Like, what's the context of this moment? What's the urgency of it? Where are we?
Sure. One of the things that's hard about teaching history is that we kind of know what happened. So one of the most important things to study this period and all periods like this is to set that aside. We don't know the outcome. We can't assume that to be the case. Today, history is often presented, and it's boring because students just take it for granted that Washington got across the Delaware. And that, of course, is not the case. Remember, he's retreated from New York all the way across the eastern seaboard, through New Jersey, through Pennsylvania. He's escaping the British. He crosses the Delaware. The British have gone into their winter encampments thinking they've won the war and it's all over, and they can relax, and they're going to, in the spring, they'll just clean it up, and this revolution will be over. Washington, on the other hand, the American troops, they've escaped to across the Delaware. Their enlistments are running out at the end of the year. Literally, their troops will go home. He has been given massive powers to take control of the revolution. This is the last leg of the revolution. It's about to expire. He uses his power that he's been given to collect boats. He calls all of his troops together. From Gates comes from the north, and the troops come up from the south. He gets them all, and they plan to cross the Delaware to support the German Hessians in Trenton, a surprise attack. Washington wants to turn the war. It's a last-ditch effort. His men will go home at the end of the year. They plan 3 crossings of Delaware, not one. They're going to 3 attempted crossings. 2 of the 3 fail. The only crossing that gets across is led by Washington, and it's on Christmas Eve, right at the end of the year before the commissions expire, to surprise the Hessians. It's ultra-secret move. They take barges across with horses and cannon and men in this ice-strewn river about to freeze over, and they surprise them. The Hessians are celebrating Christmas, and it's a decisive win. Then they cross back over the Delaware with prisoners and supplies, escaping the British again. The British come to Trenton, and then Washington crosses again and attacks them again in Trenton, and goes on to win another victory in Princeton. It's an amazing military feat. All we see are the great paintings. We forget about it. We think nothing of it, as if it's something that just happened. But it's an amazing military turn that turns the whole revolution, saves the revolutionary cause, prevents the collapse of the revolution, and allows for the American founding. It is a great turning point, historical moment.
Let's drive that point home. If all 3 of those crossings were unsuccessful, and I wonder does anyone know why those other 2 were unsuccessful? That's my first question. And then what if all 3 were unsuccessful? What do you think would have happened next? The others were unsuccessful, largely because of weather. The river was frozen in some parts, and it was very, very difficult to get across the river, and fortitude. I mean, the reasons Washington's crossing succeeded was because of George Washington. He physically forced it to occur and led his troops. And if he could do it, they would do it too. He had just previously given them a great speech. Remember, this is, if you remember something, the writings of Thomas Paine, his great call for independence, had just been published. He has it read to his troops, and he asks them to fight one more battle before your commissions expire. One more battle. Just give me one more battle. I will lead you. And he leads them across the river. I was going to ask you what morale was like. So maybe there's twofold: morale before that speech and morale after that speech.
I think the morale is very important, as in all battles. The general sense of many of his troops, and especially and many Americans around Congress, remember, had fled because of the British invasions. They thought this was the end of the revolution. It was going to expire. The British thought it was over. And so the ability to turn that around, as we think, to turn that around and get his troops to fight again, is just miraculous, and it shows his great leadership and his ability to inspire them. His troops believed in him, and because of that, he could lead that effort, and he turned the whole revolution. literally, in this case, virtually by himself.
How cold was it? This seems like such a silly, insignificant question, but on this point of morale, how miserable were these men at this moment? Away from home, losing battles, crossing rivers in disgrace and retreat, and then to add insult to injury, I've always heard the story about like they have no shoes. How much of that is true?
No, they were very well. It was a terrible situation. The river was freezing over. Literally, a whole river, the Delaware River, was freezing over. It was ice blocks. If something fell into the river, it was essentially lost. That meant a cannon, a horse, or a man. They were ill-kept. They had not much clothing. They were short on shoes. The old story was on after they crossed the river, they're going down to surprise the Hessians at Trenton, and the trail they left behind was bloodied because too many men did not have adequate shoes, and so frostbite and other human problems were extensive. But it's a great example of human fortitude to overcome those things that you don't think you can do such a thing. But inspired in the moment, the call for independence is very powerful, and they want to turn this at a crucial moment. The British have chased them all the way back, and they want to turn the war around. And Washington essentially he embodies that whole effort into himself. That's why we call him the father of the country. Without him, this would not have succeeded. And remember, once they've turned that battle, they go to Trenton, then they cross back again and fight at Princeton. Princeton is a huge American victory against Cornwallis, and from that moment on, Washington is on the offensive, pushing British troops all the way back to the eastern seaboard. Eventually, he pushes them in a way that towards the north, and then Cornwallis gets stuck in the Yorktown Peninsula, and he then shifts all of his troops from New York. Remember, this is in the 18th century when we don't have trains and cars and trucks. He shifts all of his troops, chases Cornwallis down the Yorktown Peninsula, has circles him in that encampment with the help of the French Navy, forces Cornwallis to surrender. So this really is, both from a morale point of view, but a strategic point of view, the turning point of the American Revolution.
It's amazing. Can we speak a little more generally about these founders and these the men who fought? Because, and it's been said before, obviously, but they were going up against the greatest military power at the time. Can you speak to the gall of these guys? And it's like even more than courage, or I don't even, like, how do you define it? It's just like, oh yeah, we're gonna fight against the greatest military power in the world and think we're gonna win and found a country. Like, what insane thinking is that?
It's suicidal when you think about it. Who in their right mind would do it? This was not only the greatest military power in the world at the time, but really in history. They were more powerful than Rome was at its height. They had landed the largest offensive naval invasion in world history, had just landed in New York and was chasing you across the continent. This was a crazy idea that a small army could turn the course of history and found a new nation. But I think this goes to one of the most important facts about the American Revolution, which was it was a battle. It had great leaders, but we can never forget that at the center of it, which is why we talk about and want to learn about America, were a set of liberating principles that were of great historic and moral importance, that are inspirational and still inspire many of the world to hear the words that all men are created equal. I mean, that is revolutionary, not in the sense of the French Revolution, the Chinese, the Russian Revolution, but inspiring in terms of human liberty. I mean, many causes in the world and people today yearn to be free because of those words. And those were the things that inspired George Washington. He embodied those ideas and knew what he was fighting for. And thus, this was, as he referred to many times, a sacred cause. And he was tending the sacred fire of liberty, as he called it in his farewell address. They knew what they were up to. And that ability then to inspire his troops to follow him was key to his efforts. Washington lost more battles than he won. If we look at it merely as a tally sheet, he was not a great general. On the other hand, he accomplished what he set out to do, which is why Napoleon studied Washington very carefully. He was a great general.
30 seconds, sir. I'm trying to bring it to thinking about today with, what's being taught in our schools today and 1619 Project, the whole thing, and dismissing George Washington and dismissing our founding and these great liberties. What's the one thing you would want to tell young people today, especially about this period and these men? Well,
given our conversation, what I would say is, what I have found is that history is actually better than the assumptions. We forget about it. The key is to make history come alive, and the way you make history come alive is to study it, not secondary interpretations or what people think today or what we know in hindsight, but study them, study the history itself. It is inspiring, it's powerful, it's beautiful, and it's ennobling, and that's what our young people need to see.
What a great word. Matthew Spalding, Vice President, Dean of the Graduate School, Hillsdale College in D.C., and the former Executive Director of the 1776 Commission. Go buy the book. We still hold these truths. Mr. Spalding, awesome to talk to you. Thanks for the inspiration.
Good talking to you. All right, bye-bye.
And that's our special, celebrating America's founding. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.